How does a city of over 20 million affect the wildlife and more precisely wild birds? Dr. Thomas Lovejoy, known as the godfather of biodiversity, once said, if you take care of birds, you take care of most of the environmental problems in the world. How do birds fare in and around the Chinese capital? Is their population dwindling or increasing? Is Beijing a more friendly city for birds? One Brit was so fascinated by these questions that he has dedicated the past 12 years to his feathered friends. He has also set up a website to share his stories in the wild and on the fly in China. I'm feeling chirpy today as I'm joined by British conservationist Terry Townshend, fellow of the Chicago-based think tank Paulson Institute and founder of the website Birding Beijing. Mr. Townshend, welcome to The Point. So first of all, what triggered your interest in focusing on wild bird watching in Beijing?
When I first came to Beijing for work and people found out that I liked to watch birds, the most common reaction was a sort of look of shock and bewilderment. Why are you in Beijing? There are no birds in Beijing. And this is what lots of people told me. But of course, very quickly, I realized that wasn't the case. And started to explore and realized that actually Beijing is a really good place for birds. And that's primarily because of its location on a big migratory flyway. We call it East Asia Australasian Flyway. And in fact, more than 500 species have been recorded in Beijing, which ranks Beijing number 2 in terms of G20 capital cities, in terms of number of species recorded. So Beijing is a great place for watching birds, and it's just like real estate. It's all due to the location. So we're right slap bang in the middle of this big bird expressway, where twice a year birds are migrating north and south and pass through Beijing.
Mm-hmm. So what's the state of affairs concerning the birds, especially wild bird situation in Beijing? Because Beijing, with over 20 million population, is one of the busiest and biggest capital with one of the highest populations.
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, it's sort of sometimes I think unexpected to hear that Beijing is a good place for birds. So in the last few years, there's been a real explosion in the number of people interested in birds. And so we're getting a lot more records sent to citizen science databases of different species and different in different places. And so we're getting an explosion in the number of records, which is fantastic. But we don't really have anything to compare that with, like 10, 20 years ago. So it's very difficult to say which species are increasing, which species are decreasing, and so on. But it's hard to give you a definitive answer.
I see, I understand. Still, I was going to ask you, how do things compare with 10 years ago when you first started bird watching in Beijing? I know, as you said, there is no authoritative and comprehensive data to do a scientific comparison, but just from your personal experience, what would you say is the biggest change that you noticed without, having this kind of comprehensive data analytics?
Yeah, so certainly there's been some big changes. I would say the first thing I would emphasize is the incredible awareness that's been raised over the last 10 years. So I think there are far more people today who care about the environment, who are interested in birds and nature more broadly than 10 years ago. So I think there has been a sort of environmental awakening, as I describe it, among the population. And also there have been big improvements in terms of air quality. Obviously, I think most people, realized that 10 years ago, there was quite a serious air pollution issue in Beijing and some other cities. But, now, of course, it's much, much better. And also water quality has improved a lot. So the local river in Shunyi is the Wenyu River, which sort of runs along the boundary of Shunyi and Chaoyang. And when I used to visit there, I used to have to hold my nose because it was pretty smelly. The water quality was pretty bad. But now it's really clear, and there's been a huge increase in the numbers of fish-eating water birds, so herons, egrets, cormorants, There are far more seen on this river now, which I think speaks volumes in terms of the quality of the water. So I think certainly there have been some improvements in the environment over the last 10 years, but the biggest thing I would say is the awareness.
You captured what you saw the other day, I think on the 12th of November this year, concerning a kind of bird that's called Pallas's sandgrouse. And you wrote about that, you tweeted about that, you even called it one of your best ever birding experiences. What was the story?
Yeah, that particular day, a couple of weekends ago, I just heard that a couple of people had seen one or two of these sandgrouse in different parts of Beijing. And I thought, well, maybe this is a moment when there's going to be an eruption. So I just walked to a patch of ground close to where I live that is quite typical of the habitat they like. So I thought if there's any around, maybe there'll be some there. And I very quickly realized there weren't any. But then suddenly a flock of birds flew over my head. I heard the whirring of wings, looked up, and there was a flock of sandgrouse. And I've seen very small scale eruptions before of just, a few individuals. But this was the first large scale eruption, that I've ever seen of this species. And as far as I know, it's at least 7 times the highest number was at least 7 times the previous highest count in Beijing. So it was a particularly impressive moment. And it just happened on one day, one afternoon. The next day, they were nearly all gone.
You're also said to be involved in projects to help save some of China's most endangered birds from extinction. Could you share with us one example of, efforts?
Yeah, sure. So there's a duck, actually, a diving duck called the Qingtou Chanya, the bear's pochard. And this bird, a few decades ago, it was pretty abundant, actually, in East Asia. But it's undergone a really serious decline. And we don't fully understand why that's happened. But the official numbers now are around 1,000 individuals or maybe a little bit higher. But really small numbers in terms of a whole species. And there's a lake in Hongshui-hu in Hebei province, about 300 kilometers south of Beijing, where some were found breeding. And so there was a huge effort went into try to protect these birds and to protect the habitat that they need, because they have a particular preference for fresh water. It's quite still and with a lot of vegetation. And so there was a huge effort that went in from Chinese universities, NGOs, working with the Hongshui local government, and bringing in international expertise from different areas who've worked on similar species before. Then there's been a huge turnaround. So now that lake is very well protected. Previously, there was a lot of poaching and illegal fishing and quite a lot of activity there. Right. Now it's been completely turned around, and the ducks are doing very well there.
Yeah, it's also said that you've been involved in an innovative community-based program which tracks many of Beijing's iconic birds. This community-based program, is that the kind of effort that you just mentioned? How does it work, and how is it working?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that drives me in everything I do is to try to build more awareness about biodiversity and nature. So that there's a very famous quote from a Senegalese conservationist who said that in the end, everyone wants to protect what they love, but you can only love what you know. And so if you don't know what you have around you, you don't fall in love with it. And if you don't fall in love with it, you don't want to protect it. So I think one of the keys to fixing the biodiversity crisis is to make more people aware of what they have around them. We recently tracked the Beijing swift, the Beijing Yuyan, from the summer palace, and we found out it goes all the way to South Africa for the northern winter before returning to Beijing. And even more incredibly, they do that journey without landing at all. So they eat in the air, they drink in the air, and they sleep in the air. And so this is an incredible story, about one bird in Beijing. And we've seen how that can inspire people to make changes to the way that we live and the way we make buildings, the way we make the cities friendly for wildlife. So we've seen schools now putting up special boxes for swifts. We've seen building companies commit to making their new buildings more friendly for swifts. So when they hear these stories, they're really inspired, and that can make people do incredible things.
What still remains the biggest challenge for wildlife conservation, especially wild bird protection in China? What is your gauge of the current efforts ongoing?
Well, I think what's so important with bird conservation, because most birds are migratory, and so what we're seeing now in China is some big changes in terms of taking responsibility for sort of China's role in the flyway. So just one example is the coastal wetlands on the Yellow Sea. So the Bohai Bay and the Yellow Sea are vital for migratory shorebirds that breed up in the Arctic Circle and spend the winter as far away as Australia, New Zealand. And the Yellow Sea mudflats, the intertidal mudflats, are like a big 5-star service station for these birds. You know, it's where they can find lots of great food. They rest before they continue these journeys. And we've lost quite a lot of those wetlands over the last few decades to development, so reclaiming land close to the sea. But in 2019, the State Council issued a ban on further coastal wetland reclamation. And they nominated the most important sites to become World Heritage Sites, which of course means that they are very strongly protected and sustainably managed. And so we're now seeing a complete turnaround in policy, and we're seeing some of those sites becoming, being restored, protected, and celebrated, for what they are, which is that these incredible natural heritage.
We are going to have the COP15 on biodiversity in Canada. What does your experience tell us about the kind of efforts needed to protect biodiversity?
Yeah, absolutely. So COP15 Part 2 coming up in Montreal, which is under China's presidency, of course. For me, it's the most important environmental meeting we've ever had, because it's the place where we're due to have agreement on a new global biodiversity framework looking forward over the next 10 years. And this is vital because our biodiversity is in crisis. The populations of vertebrates globally have fallen by about 69% just since 1970. 90% of the large fish have disappeared in the ocean. The extinction rate is thought to be 1,000 times the natural rate. 96% of the biomass of all the mammals on Earth today are humans or the livestock on which we depend. So we're in a pretty drastic situation, and we really need to find a way forward that's going to slow and stop that biodiversity loss. So I think this meeting coming up in Montreal is really, really important. And I think one of the key things we have to do is find a way to value nature in our economies. So at the moment, we don't really put a value on our natural capital, and therefore we don't penalize those people who destroy it, and we don't reward those people who protect and restore it. And so we have to find a way of integrating nature into our economies. And that's vital, because in the end of the day, humans evolved in and are dependent on nature. So what we do to nature, we do to ourselves.
We have to leave it there. Many thanks to Terry Townshend sharing with us your birding experience in Beijing. I hope we have more bird chips in the morning waking us up to a good day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.